Custodes are one of the hardest armies for world leaders to beat in the current meta. Today, I'm going to show you how you can crush these golden gods. So grab yourselves a brew and let's dive in. The meta which has developed following the January balance data slate has seen a massive resurgence in Custodes. At time of filming, they are one of the most represented factions in tournaments, paired with one of the highest win percentages. A combination of the army being easy to collect, paint and play, paired with significant buffs, has resulted in an influx of golden armored warriors across tournament tables. This poses a complex problem for world leaders since the Custodes can dominate the fight phase in a variety of different ways, making them a stat check army for our faction. Given their high player count, we have to consider them as a likely opponent if we're going to an event, and the puzzle they present is one which isn't easily solved, relying heavily on the world leader's player outskilling the Custodes' opponent. Today, I'm going to showcase some of the best methods I've employed to make sure that I get the win against Custodes. This is an amalgamation of my own experiences and cultivated ideas from our Patreon competitive community. I'll briefly discuss what you're likely to see in a Custodes army, what you need to be aware of, and then dive into the tactics for beating them. Let's get into this episode of Competitive Insights. Most top Custodes lists at the minute revolve around 4 to 5 bricks of infantry with attached characters. Typically, this will include 2 to 3 Warden units and some Custodian Guard, though Allarus Terminators are seeing a rise in popularity. Occasionally, you will also see a Caladius Grav Tank, though these are becoming rarer as Custodes players are tending towards more durable infantry spam. Understanding the typical composition of a Custodes list is very important for working out a play pattern to beat them, so it's a good idea to browse recent tournament lists and get a detailed picture of what you could be facing. Custodes also have a host of really powerful stratagems. These include reactive fights first while on an objective, -1 damage in combat or shooting, +1 to wound versus monsters and vehicles, and more. This, coupled with their unit abilities, allows the Custodes to dominate the fight phase and dictate play heavily, even when it isn't their turn. Wardens, for example, could have a 4-up Feel No Pain, -1 damage, -1 to wound, and fights first, all in one go. Importantly, shield captains can also make some of these stratagems free to use, making the defensive buffs easily accessible for the Custodes player. Inexperienced world leader players will often send units into the golden meat grinder and be shocked when almost nothing dies, only for their own army to collapse on the strike back. The result of all this is that Custodes will want to play around the midboard, setting up defensively on objectives and withstanding assaults, while being able to put out punishing amounts of damage in return. As a melee focused army, world leaders really struggle with combating this, and we need to play extremely carefully and sensibly if we want to come out on top. Understanding when to make your moves, recognizing weaknesses, committing the right amount of force, and pacing your gameplay are key elements which need to be mastered if you want to overcome this army. So let's look at some of the best tactics which can be leveraged to overcome the Emperor's finest. The first and most important thing to remember when playing against Custodes is that the World Leaders player really needs to dial back on speed and aggression in the opening turns. Personally, I like to use the first turn or two to stage my army within runes, which are relatively central and good staging points for launching an assault. To ensure that those units are not themselves threatened by a Custodes push, I usually screen them with jackals, rhinos, or whatever cheap chaff I have to hand. If you push out too early with key units against Custodes, you risk losing vital assets on their counter push, and while you may accumulate a few early points, you'll really suffer in the late game as a result. Because Custodes typically don't have a lot of heavy shooting, Angron can be extremely useful in this matchup, as he can actually go for an early strike if they've left a unit exposed, or a pace around the midboard staging for a big push. He can be an excellent tool if the Custodes unit is caught out in the open and not on an objective, and if you trade him early, you maximize the chance of him returning later too. He's probably the only unit I would consider throwing at the Custodes early in the game, but the rest of the army needs to spend some time staging and preparing. You want to bait the Custodes in and then jump on them hard. On that note, here's a little tactic I like to call the fishing lure. Usually, Custodes don't have cheap throwaway units, but world leaders can do. This can be something like 3 8-bound, 5 berserkers without a character, or even a squad of jackals. In turn 2, I like to move one or two of these units out onto an objective, potentially backed up by a threatening unit nearby, but one which is difficult for the Custodes player to engage with. The Custodes player will have little choice but to deal with this lure, otherwise they allow you to rack up primary points, but it means they have to commit a significant unit to the table if they want to flip it. It's a good way of breaking the standoff, forcing them to come out and play, and providing you with important information for your strike back. For added usefulness, I like to have Fight and Death up in this turn, so even the lure unit may do some damage as it dies. Importantly, it means you forced the Custodes' hand and dictated the opening engagement, giving you the initiative for how the battle proceeds from there. Following the fishing lure, I normally have 2 waves of assault set up. The first wave usually consists of some heavy hammers mixed with nuisance units. Mo with the Berserker Glaive is a good candidate to send out in this wave, since he has the capacity to snipe out characters, which massively weakens the Custodes' defensive capacity, especially on Wardens, who will lose their -1 to wound ability. Whatever you send out in wave 1 needs to be able to do its job well, because it will almost certainly die in response. I rarely look to fully kill squads at this point, instead aiming to cripple 2 to 3 brick units, which then become vulnerable to clean up from wave 2. The second wave then capitalizes on this damage done by wave 1, pushing hard on a couple of objectives and attempting to dominate the board state. Normally, there will be one sector of the board which I give up completely to the Custodes, typically wherever Trajan and his Wardens are hanging out, but I will try to completely dominate the other midfield objectives, and wave 2 is key to this. At this point, the Custodes player may be reeling from wave 1 and working with diminished resource and less CP. If you've managed to slam out some of their characters, their capacity to throw up defensive abilities will be massively diminished. This is when you want some painful hammer units like Exalted 8-bound, Khorne and 10 Berserkers and the like to start making their mark. After that, it's scrap time. You're both probably going to be working with very few resources, but if your waves of assault were successful, you'll have racked up enough points and board space to pull ahead. In summary, playing a slower game against Custodes, broken up into staged assaults, and led by a lure to pull them in, is key to dictating the pace of the game and forcing the Custodes to play reactively. If you pick your fights correctly and balance your waves of assault well, you'll find yourself in a commanding position very quickly. You need to cripple them first, baiting out as much of their abilities as possible, and then hammer them with the kitchen sink, the slow cooker and the air fryer in a Hail Mary that puts the game to bed one way or the other. This general game plan will help shift the balance in your favour, but what about more detailed tactics and specific situations you can exploit? Let's look at some of those now. One of the most powerful abilities Custodes have, which can completely neuter a World Leader's assault, is the ability to spend 2 CP and gain fights first on a unit which is on an objective. This can completely shift the dynamic of a World Leader's go turn and have dramatic effects on the board state. Obviously, an easy solution to this is to charge Custodes when they aren't on an objective, and while I do recommend always keeping an eye out for this opportunity, it's not usually going to be possible. So how do we get around this dreaded fights first? Well, the answer is simpler than you might think, and it comes in the shape of the beloved Rhino. To accurately explain this tactic, I've set up a little demo situation. We've got Custodian Guard camping an objective, meaning they can pop the fights first stratagem if I charge them. I've got 6 Exalted 8-bound who desperately want to get stuck in, and a humble Rhino nearby. It's my charge phase, and the first thing I'll do is assess the enemy unit placement. As long as all the Custodes aren't totally bunched up with their bases touching each other, this is the perfect opportunity to spring what I call the Rhino Drift. I'm going to start the charge phase off by charging in the Rhino, and let's say I roll an average 7 here. I'm going to move the Rhino in lengthways, partly blocking off the Exalted 8-bound, but importantly I'm basing as many of the Custodian Guard as possible. Then I will charge in my Exalted 8-bounds. Let's say I've got an 8 for them, and the important bit here is to move with the back guys first, so I can use them to screen out my front models from moving up too far. The goal here is to base as few of the Custodian Guard as possible with the Exalted 8-bound, but still ensuring that with a pile-in, everyone can make combat. Because of how the fight phase works, all the Custodian Guard who are in base combat with the Rhino will have to fight into it, and since they aren't in base contact with the models who are touching the Exalted 8-bound, they won't be able to chain attacks into them. Furthermore, the guys at the back here will have to pile into the Rhino, since they need to move towards the closest enemy model when piling in. This means that if the Custodes player wants to use the fight first stratagem, the majority of attacks will have to go into the Rhino, meaning my Exalted 8-bound are almost guaranteed to be safe and able to cut down the enemy. Of course, this tactic isn't exclusive to the Rhino. You can actually leverage the same concept even more effectively using something like Jackals or multi-charging in several powerful combat units. In summary, you want to create a situation where if the Custodes player chooses to use fight first, they will have to inefficiently split their attacks across several units, diluting their effectiveness and ensuring that your units still deliver a potent punch. Let's have a look at a slightly different way of circumnavigating fights first now. This one I like to call the line breaker move. In this example, we have 2 units of Custodian Guard, one off an objective and screening another which remains on the objective. We've got Khorne and 10 Berserkers, nicely positioned to charge the screening unit, and a squad of Exalted 8-bounds, who could comfortably reach either. However, we know if we charge the unit on the objective, we risk the dreaded fights first, so we're going to ignore that one for now. I start the charge phase off with Khorne squad, and let's say they hit a 6, easily allowing them to make combat with the screen unit. Then, I send in the Exalted 8-bound into the same unit, charging in at the back like this. I'll select Khorne's unit to fight, and they should comfortably overcome these Custodian Guard, meaning the 8-bound have no one left to hit. Or do they? Because they are a unit which has charged in this turn, they are legally allowed to make a pile-in move, provided they end in engagement range with an enemy unit. In this case, I pile them into the Custodian Guard on the objective, and since pile-in is the first step in activating a unit to fight, the Custodian player is unable to use their fight first ability. It's a cheeky way of totally countering the ability, but it requires the Custodes player to make some positioning and movement errors. But these are things that you need to be on the lookout for. Let's move on now to talk about the golden elephant in the room, the Custodian Wardens. This unit is easily one of the most daunting forces in the Custodes army and is extremely difficult for us to interact with. Wardens have many powerful abilities, including -1 to wound when the attacker's strength exceeds their toughness when they're led by a character, a once per game 4-up feel no pain, and like all Custodes units, the ability to be -1 to be hit and -1 damage. With so many defensive abilities, it can be extremely difficult to crack the unit apart. So how do we do it? Firstly, you have to come to terms with the reality of the situation. You are never going to be able to pick up a full Warden unit in one go, so you have to eat it a bite at a time. This harkens back to the overall play strategy I talked about earlier and the need for multiple waves of units. Your first attack into a Warden unit needs to be a scalpel strike, designed to bait out defensive abilities and possibly snipe a character. Typically, I try to launch the strike when the Warden unit is still moving up the board and before it's had a chance to settle down on an objective. With this in mind, let's talk about some good candidate units for that scalpel strike. Top of the list here is the Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive and 5 Berserkers. Mo with precision and full rerolls is the natural candidate for lopping off the head of a character leading a Warden unit, which is really important to kill since they lose their -1 to wound ability as soon as he's gone. Aside from that, 5 Berserkers may pull down a Warden in addition, but even if they don't, you've managed to significantly weaken the unit, and possibly you've baited out the 4-up Feel No Pain. Trying to force them to use this ability early is very important, since it makes the unit very vulnerable to a follow-up counterpunch. So if you succeed in baiting the Feel No Pain and taking out a character, that Warden unit is ripe for the slaughter. Other units which may be less likely to nab the character but more likely to force the Feel No Pain out are something like 3 8-bound with an attached Invocatus. Invocatus can threaten an epic challenge, though he isn't very likely to actually kill the Custodian character, especially if they pop the Feel No Pain, but the risk of not using the ability exposes the Wardens to the possibility of losing 2 to 3 of their unit, especially due to the 3 damage Lacerators. You could combine this with a Rhino Drift to force most of the Wardens to fight into the Rhino, also tar pitting the enemy and creating a very annoying situation for the Custodes player. Once you've pulled off the Scalpel Strike, you need to hit the Wardens with a Hammer Blow. Now, hammers are one thing our army doesn't lack, so take your pick from the list. Personally, I'm loving 6 Exalted, backed up by a Demon Prince on foot with the Helm of Brazen-Ire. If the squad has been injured, these guys will go in hard, and even if the Custodes pop fight first, the combination of a 4+ invulnerable save and feel no pain on the Exalted, as well as the Prince being tough as nails, will mitigate a lot of the damage. They'll likely clean up the Wardens in response, removing a nasty threat from the Custodes army. There's other ways you can get around the Wardens, such as dumping a Forge Fiend into them to bait the Feel No Pain, or launching Angron into their midst to pull out a few of the squad, but I think this method, using a Scalpel and a Hammer, is probably the most common one for getting around the issue. And this may seem like a complex way of dealing with just one unit, but it is very important to approach the Warden problem correctly. If you just lob units into the meat grinder, they will almost certainly come out on top. But if you deal with them in a 2-stage process, they'll probably go down, and you'll flip an area of the board back in your favour. Typically, a Custodes list will be running 2 to 3 of these Warden bricks, so while we can probably always deal with 2, the third may have to be left to its own devices, and I usually pivot my army away from wherever they are. Finally, let's review some of the options at our disposal for applying to the Custodes matchup. I'm going to touch on the best blessings of Khorne to use here, what units I've been enjoying into the Custodes match, and what are the key stratagems you always need to consider. The blessings are relatively straightforward. Like all melee matchups, the Fight on Death blessing becomes very valuable into Custodes. It allows you to trade better, and crucially, the Custodes player can't use reactive defensive abilities like -1 damage against models which are fighting on death, since they don't trigger the correct situations for using the stratagem. This allows you to set up lures and screens, which may actually bring down a Custodian or two, or in the case of a Hammer squad like Exalted 8-bound, actually do some serious damage from the grave. The blessing for sustained hits is also really vital in this matchup. Most of the time, the Custodes player will have the Kata for -1 to hit up, which results in about a 16% decrease in hit roll efficiency. Thankfully, putting up sustained increases this efficiency by exactly the same amount, so you can effectively mitigate this Kata by putting this blessing up. Conversely, I would actually rarely consider lethal hits, even against Wardens, since it's almost always more efficient to use sustained over lethal, unless you're wounding on 5s and 6s. It goes without saying that the Feel No Pain blessing is a must-have in this one too. You probably want it up when you're anticipating a big push from the Custodes, so your units become a little bit stickier, and it pairs beautifully with our -1 damage stratagem, meaning a Custode squad goes from guaranteed killing 10 berserkers to struggling to kill half. It also oomps the Exalted 8-bound up to the point where they are rivaling Custodes for defensive strength, especially alongside a Demon Prince. It's a great one to throw up after you've made a wave 1 push and killed a unit, since you can pay a CP to get it on the army. Finally, while I think the +2 move is super useful here, you probably won't need Advance and Charge unless you're badly out of position. The slower play pattern, which is key to winning the Custodes game, means the board state usually becomes quite close and confined. This means Advance and Charge generally isn't necessary, but situations may arise where you need to launch a squad in deep. Regarding key units, most of what we know and love are still relevant in the Custodes game, but there are some interesting unit combos I've been playing with, which I've found particularly useful. The main one I want to highlight here is the Demon Prince on foot. In particular, giving this guy the Helm enhancement for having all damage can be a massive asset into the Custodes. Their combat and ranged output will pretty much decrease to 1 damage across the board, meaning the Prince becomes an incredibly difficult target for them to kill. Coupled with his 3 damage strikes, this guy can become a proper brawler, but the main benefit in my mind is his invulnerable save boosting aura. When you pair this guy with 8-bound variants, particularly Exalted, they functionally become Custodes with a 4-up invul, T6, and Feel No Pain that can be boosted. This means that while we may struggle to kill a lot of Custodes, we can form a life star around the Prince, which is almost equally difficult for them to interact with, and can be a great way of locking down a section of the board. Additionally, some of our lesser seen ranged units are also quite valuable into the Custodes game. Namely, both the Predator Destructor and Forge Fiend shine here. Both have access to high volume 3 damage guns, which are perfectly positioned to fire into Custodes bricks. Targeting these into Wardens can force them to activate the 4-up Feel No Pain early on, or risk losing several vital models, meaning the squad will either be softened up or without a key buff when you make your move to charge them. In particular, the Forge Fiend's ability to battle shock on units it shoots can also be huge in this match, since it could create a situation where a Custodes unit can activate neither fights first nor the -1 damage. And while it's unlikely to actually go off due to their high leadership, it is something that is always worth remembering and considering when picking your targets. Our keystone units, Berserkers, 8-man variants, and Angron are all good picks in the Custodes game, and I won't dive deeply into their use here since it's pretty self-explanatory. So, while the overall archetype of a World Leaders list doesn't massively change into Custodes, some fringe picks are worth considering since they have particularly interesting interactions when it comes to dealing with the boys in gold. Finally, stratagem management and usage is pretty much vital to ensuring the game flows correctly. Because of the slower pace of the game, you'll tend to build up CP in the first couple of turns, and this is a good thing, because when you choose to start engaging and playing aggressively, you will need a decent CP bank to activate several strats in a single turn. Key here are the +1 to wound against character vehicle monster units and -1 damage. Receiving a Custodes assault with -1 damage up and the Feel No Pain blessing can massively swing the balance in the World Leader's favour. This is especially true on Exalted 8-bound units, particularly if they are in range of that Demon Prince on foot, since it makes them rock hard and capable of withstanding serious punishment. But it is also great on Berserkers, who can actually tank pretty well with these buffs in place. +1 to wound is vital for countering the Warden wound debuff or just pushing through the T6 stat line across the Custodes army. Shifting that wound dice 1 pip in your favour will give back significant returns, as we all know, and I think once the blood starts flowing, you'll need this stratagem in pretty much every single turn. Additionally, the strat to throw up a third blessing really comes into play in this game. It's particularly useful if you are at the top of the turn, since you can launch an assault with aggressive blessings in place, and then use this strat at the end to activate either Feel No Pain or Fight on Death to posture defensively in the face of a counterpunch from the Custodes. Normally I would throw up Fight on Death here, unless I'm anticipating a lot of my 8-bound units being charged, but both buffs are worth considering in most cases. Alternatively, the strat can be used in your combat phase if you've charged something like a Sister Squad and butchered them, and you can throw up an important combat buff like sustained hits, which will then be active for the rest of the fights in that turn. As always, remembering the strat for sticking an objective is quite important. Particularly in this matchup, it can force a Custodes unit to pull away from the main fight and disrupt their positioning. That said, I do think the focus should be on the aforementioned strats, since they are pretty much pivotal to the flow of the game. To summarize, the Custodes game is definitely one of the more challenging puzzles for World Leaders right now, but it is not an insurmountable obstacle. By slowing down your game and managing fights on a micro scale, exposing positioning mistakes and utilizing techniques like the fishing lure and the Rhino Drift, you can dictate the pace of the game and gain control of the board state. It requires a lot of concentration and focus to ensure that you don't make mistakes, and you need discipline to hold your assault until the time is right. But if you nail these aspects down, it can become quite an easy match. The Custodes game hinges heavily on the World Leaders player outskilling the Custodes player. So the next time you see them across the board, keep these things in mind and make sure you claim plenty of their skulls. For now though, that does conclude the video. Special thanks to our Patreons who workshopped this one with me in the Patreon competitive section of the Discord. If you want to be part of this, you can sign up through the link below. It helps support the Red Path and adds more nail-ridden brains to the fun. If you have enjoyed it or found it helpful, please drop it a like, comment, or consider subscribing if you haven't already. Our Discord is the place to be if you want to continue the conversation, and new faces are always welcome, so check out the link below. As always, I have been Dara, you've been watching The Red Path, and until the next one, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.